the language of Job is really, really unique. Every chapter has about 10 words that never occur anywhere else in the history of the Hebrew language. My pastor didn't tell me that it was actually one of the latest books written. Lisa, may I have a bit more? And more is spelled M-O-A-H, or Sa is spelled S-U-H, it's not spelled S-I-R, like, standard English, we spell it as S-I-R. And that's really how Job is written. It's kind of like this takes place in a galaxy far away at a time long, long ago. And these people all talk funny. The beginning of Job, he is like super perfect. Everything about him is so perfect. He's just like, I'm making all these extra sacrifices just in case my kids sin, Why do you always have to look for some little sin that we do? Why do you have to care so much about what we're doing down here when you've got all of creation to think about?
Hey everyone, this is What Your Pastor Didn't Tell You. Today I'm talking to Ryan Armstrong on the book of Job. We're going to be talking about authorship, dating, whether it's historical, and peculiar things that the book of Job uses from Genesis. Ryan, can you tell us a little bit about yourself? Say hi and what we're doing today?
Yeah, sure thing, Zach. Or do you pronounce it Zach?
That's a first. We'll go with Zach.
Okay. Yeah, sure thing. My name is Ryan M. Armstrong. I grew up in the Seattle area. Actually, I was born in San Diego and moved around a lot. And Seattle feels most like home. And did my undergrad was communication and pre-law. I was going to go to law school, and then all of a sudden, senior year, completely changed direction and just wanted to study more. And I almost got another degree in philosophy or history, and finally just decided to get an MDiv. So I did a Master's of Divinity at Southeastern Seminary in North Carolina, then a THM in New Testament there. And then I did another master's degree in Hebrew Bible and Ancient Near East at Hebrew University of Jerusalem. And from there, I ended up going to Princeton Seminary for my PhD, which I am walking in 2 weeks. So just defended the dissertation and just became Dr. Armstrong. So it's pretty exciting. So that's my background. I wrote my dissertation on the book of Job. Wrote on mediation in the book of Job. And it's been really, really fun. I really fell in love with the project. I'm really looking forward to I started a YouTube channel where I just couldn't stop talking about the book of Job, talking about my research, just kind of creating these outlets for it. And right now I'm editing it for publication, hoping to submit it for publication maybe by the end of the month. So hopefully that's going to be coming out at some point.
Awesome. Yeah. No, I'm really excited for your channel and what you're bringing to the table, because there really isn't a lot of focus on Job. I mean, you get like, the general overview, but like nobody's really, making much of an effort to like talk about all the intricacies of it. I mean, it's a pretty complicated book. So
thank you so much. Yeah, it's very complicated. Yeah. And I'm going to be, I had to take a little hiatus from YouTube for just a couple months. I got married 2 weeks ago. So that was we did kind of a shotgun COVID wedding. And then the official ceremony is going to be a few months from now. But we're starting her immigration process. She's from Brazil. So we got married really quick to start the immigration process. So that happened. And then, revising my dissertation, the final submission is on Tuesday for that. And I'll be walking next in 2 weeks. And then I'm trying to submit it for publication. So I had to step back from YouTube, focus a little bit on life and adjusting to married life and a little bit of academic stuff. And I also want to work a little bit on content and get ahead of the content a little bit. It was really hard to do that on top of everything. So I want to get a little bit ahead of the content so I can release videos more consistently. So shooting for August or September to come back onto YouTube with, I'll probably start with more introductory stuff, maybe hermeneutics, how to approach the Bible. And then I'll talk a little bit more about the book of Job and how we interpret it. And then I'll do some more theme videos like I have been.
Awesome. Yeah. Link will be in the description. Everyone should go check them out. So on the book of Job, when would you say it's written?
That's a great question. It seems like most scholars today say that it was written in the Persian period, which is, maybe the time of the exile or just after the exile, just after they come back from the exile, which would make it one of the latest books written, which is kind of reverse of what I grew up hearing in the church, which my pastor didn't tell me that it was actually one of the latest books written. So, and there's actually a very good reason that people think that it was written early. The first is that the style of it, the way that it's presented, it feels like you're reading Genesis. Like the way Job is described with all of his herds and all this stuff. It sounds like this kind of nomad from that time period. The poems of it, it sounds like these ancient poems from like the Pentateuch, like the earliest written poems, Judges 5, like this kind of like hard to understand, this kind of, you're reading Shakespeare. It's like this, like for us today, we feel like we're reading Shakespeare, like such this kind of weird language. And so the book is really written to sound like it took place back at the time of Abraham. And even Job's lifespan, it's, hundreds of years. It's like the olden days when everybody used to live, outlive everyone and stuff like that. So it's kind of written to sound like it takes place from that period. And there's actually a rich tradition that Moses wrote the book of Job. Both Jews and Christians throughout history have said that Moses wrote the book of Job. And this is really rich tradition. It goes back a long way. Some people think that there's kind of a little bit of a harmonizing motivation in there too, that Job is so skeptical of so much theology and so much of what we want to say the Bible teaches. So there's a rich tradition that Moses wrote the book of Job, and some scholars actually read a pretty good article recently arguing that there's kind of a harmonizing motivation in there. Job is so skeptical of so much theology, and when you say that Moses actually wrote the book, then you have to say, wow, okay, so it can't be contradicting the Pentateuch. And it has to be, it's written by the same guy that wrote the Pentateuch. And so it's kind of like a little bit of a extra protection there against people who might take Job too far or, go too far against orthodoxy with Job, because Job is hard to swallow for a lot of theologians. It doesn't pull any punches. Right. So you're asking about dating. I'll give you a little evidence for why it's Persian period. So the way it describes the Sabaeans and the Chaldeans specifically, it sounds a lot more like 6th century. The Chaldeans, the way they attack, they're not really like farmers or nomads. They're kind of more the way that they're described is it sounds a lot like 6th century. A lot of the place names are kind of more 6th century. There's a few other little clues too. The one is the use of Jeremiah. So Ed Greenstein wrote an article that arguing that Jeremiah was an inspiration for Job. Jeremiah is another righteous sufferer, and Jeremiah, a lot of the things that Jeremiah says, Job kind of repeats. And when you're kind of looking at which one is first, that's always a big question. But Greenstein argues that there's a couple of ways that you can kind of tell which text is basing it, which text is based on which. And one is like which one seems a little more exaggerated or the language is a little more jarring. Well, okay, let's just talk about what actually happens. So in chapter 3, Job 3, he cursed the day of his birth. And it's very close to Jeremiah cursing the day of his birth in chapter 20. And so Jeremiah says, I cursed the day of my birth. And Job is very exaggerated, more exaggerated than Jeremiah. And so you could say, well, okay, maybe Jeremiah was taking Job and then trying to kind of calm it down a little bit. But the thing is, Jeremiah already seems exaggerated. Jeremiah's like, I cursed the day of my birth, and I hope that the man who announced to my dad, you have a son, I hope that he ends up like the nations that God destroys. Like, it's like, I want everything destroyed from that day. I want my mother, like all this stuff about the day of his birth and the super duper curse against the day of his birth. And then Job takes that and goes even farther than Jeremiah. And Job's like, I want to curse the day of my birth, and I want to wipe it out from memory. And then I want to go back at the day that I was conceived. I want that day completely erased from all of history. And then he like goes even further than Jeremiah. So it seems like Jeremiah was probably first. Jeremiah's already going. Jeremiah took it another level. And then Job's like, let's see how far we can take this. Boom, hyperdrive, and just went even further than Jeremiah. So, and it's not just Job 3, but several other places where it seems like Job is pulling from Jeremiah and really influenced a lot by Jeremiah, and like suing God. Jeremiah talks about suing God, and Jeremiah is like, this is crazy. I gotta sue God. And then Job goes even beyond that. Job's like, I need to sue God, and I need a judge that can say, God, you're wrong, and Job, you're right. Like he just like goes really crazy with suing God. So all these things, it seems like Jeremiah was first before Job. So Job was probably towards the end of the exile, or maybe just after the exile. There's one other thing too that's really juicy. It's that at the end of the book, when God restores Job's fortunes, I think it says in English, God restored the fortunes of Job. This is the only time that phrase is used of a human. Is Shuva Shvit or Shava Shvit in Hebrew. And so Shuva Shvut, I think, in some places. But anyway, Shuva Shvit in Hebrew. And so when it probably the etymology originally meant restore from captivity, or restore the captivity of. And it's used of nations everywhere else in the book. And it's used consistently of restoration from exile of Israel. And so at the end of the book, it's like this kind of little like, let's toss this out. And if you're reading the Hebrew Bible, you read the story of Israel and the Israelites, and this happens to them, this happens, this all of God's people, and then stop. Meanwhile, long ago in a galaxy far, far away, there lived this man in the land of Uts that we don't even know where it is. It's somewhere out there in the desert somewhere, and this stuff happens. Has nothing to do with Israel or anything. And then at the end, it's like, and now back to our regular programming. So it's like the whole book of Job, it kind of takes place in this faraway land. Has nothing to do with Israel. And then at the end, there's this little like, remember the exile? Remember how much you guys suffered, Israel? Well, God's restored Job the exact same way. So there's kind of like a little, I don't want to read into it too much, but it does seem like there's a little bit of a what's the word? Like a reference to the exile, or kind of a little, which is also a phrase that the Jeremiah uses a lot, the Shuva Shvit, the restoration from exile, looking forward to the restoration.
That's so fascinating. Wow. Okay. So would you say that, I guess one of the questions when you date a text, specifically like with something like Genesis, is you have some things where people be like, okay, this is definitely older. And then you have other things where it's like, okay, that's definitely younger. And then, some people be like, okay, well, the text must be completely young. And then those other people, the people that think it's an older text, would be like, oh, that was just like an edit, and then the rest of it's old. So like, how do you differentiate that with the book of Job?
That's a great question, actually. And there's this is always an issue. It's always, when a text is written. So actually, my wife, my new bride, she pointed out the similarities between the Hamilton the musical and the Book of Job. Hamilton, it's about this historic figure from 200 years ago, and it's about like kind of this, really trying to present this story that a lot of us know, or we can find it in a history book or whatever, and then it tells the whole thing as a hip-hop musical. And so with Job, it's very similar, actually. Like there's kind of this ancient legend about Job, which maybe I'll talk about it a little bit, but they kind of rewrote the story as a hip hop musical. And so with Hamilton, it's not really trying to sound like, or trying to trick anybody or make anybody think like, this is a document that we found from the founding fathers of America, and they talked in these rap battles the whole time. It's not like trying to trick anybody. It's kind of like there's a lot of modern day stuff that's mixed in, but it's also really not trying to rewrite history or anything like that. Like it's true to history, but it's in a genre format that that modern day people can relate to and understand. And that's really how the Book of Job is written. And with any text, you know, we're always trying to ask, like, how long after the events or how long after the setting was it written? Was it 10 years or was it 200 years afterward? So that's always going to be a question. You know, Shakespeare wrote on Julius Caesar 1500 years after Julius Caesar lived. So there's always kinds of these questions about dating. That's always going to be a question and an issue. But with Job, it seems like there's enough in there where we're probably not really where it's probably not really trying to sound like it was written really early. It doesn't really. I don't really get the feeling that it's trying to. In fact, in chapter 19, Job references the Bisitun inscription. He talks about how, like, man, I just wish my words would be written down in a book, and not just that. I wish they were engraved into a rock and then filled with an iron stylus and then filled with lead, and then they would last forever. And we really only have one inscription that's like this, and it was written during the Persian period. So, you know, maybe others existed at some point or whatever, but the only one that we really have found is this huge Persian inscription from Darius the Great that was written just like this. And so Job is like, man, I want this amazing pillar to be erected that will last forever. And Darius just did that like a couple years before it was written, probably. He did this amazing pillar that's inscribed in lead and stylus, iron stylus, and it has lasted forever. It's still standing today. And so you can go see it today. So it's kind of this. So it seems like it's there's all these like kind of winks to the audience, if you will, where like, you know, like, yeah, we're talking about this ancient time, but the way they talk, it makes sense to modern day audiences. That said, the language of Job is really, really unique. And every chapter has about 10 words that never occur anywhere else in the history of the Hebrew language. It's just really, really unique. And the whole thing is written in, like, we call it mimesis, or maybe I dialect is kind of a more like more colloquial way of saying, where you kind of like the way Mark Twain writes. You know, like things are misspelled, and these words aren't part of the English language, but he's writing to try to mimic the dialect of the South at the time, or the way Charles Dickens writes. You know, where when characters talk, they say things like, "Please, sir, may I have a bit more?" And more is spelled M-O-A-H, or Sir is spelled S-U-H, you know. It's not spelled S-I-R, like, you know, standard English, we spell it as S-I-R. And that's really how Job is written. It's kind of like this takes place in a galaxy far away at a time long, long ago. And these people all talk funny. And it's like there's a lot of Aramaic thrown in, and a lot of scholars would argue that Arabic and Akkadian is thrown in too. That there's kind of this mix of all these other language influence in Job. And the other thing with Job is that it's not consistent. The dialect is not consistent. So if it was like an actual dialect, like I would probably be saying the same things in the same way consistently. But in Job, you have some words that are written in Aramaic but used with Hebrew morphemes. So like if I said, if I was writing about people in Mexico, and I said, yeah, he said to the other guy, no, senor, you are very stupido, or whatever, you know, trying to use these Spanish words and Spanish morphemes to recreate this kind of like foreign environment or whatever. So Job is written like this with a lot of Aramaisms thrown in, but like kind of a mix of Hebrew, and it's not consistent. So in sometimes it's like an Aramaic word with Hebrew morphemes. And other places, it's a Hebrew word with Aramaic morphemes. Sometimes it's the same word, or even the same, like, but it's just switched around in different ways. So it's not really consistent dialect. And it seems like it's kind of, a lot of it is used to fuel poetry. There's a lot of word plays. There's a lot of, like, if something means something in Aramaic, the author's like, oh, that's the opposite of what it means in Hebrew. I'm using that, you know. So there's a lot of like fun little plays with the poetry like that with Job. So it seems like we want to come to these ancient poems. We want to come to these poems. We want to say, oh, this language is so foreign. It must be super ancient. But really, in a lot of ways, it's kind of more serving. It's intended to sound ancient, but it really isn't. It's kind of more serving the poetry of the book.
Wow. Okay. That's not the turn I expected. No, I mean, when I first think of that, I think of if there's certain parts of the book are written in a certain way, and then the rest is written a different way, written in a different way, and then so on, and there's all different places like that. My first thought would be, okay, maybe different authors or editors or something like that. But you think it's on purpose to try to imitate a different time period?
Yeah, I do. Yeah, I wouldn't say that there were no editors or no secondary authors involved. Like I don't need to. I don't want to make a hard stance on that one way or the other. I think that yeah, there could very well have been multiple authors involved, but the language of it's not reflecting a specific dialect, and I think because it's such a different, unique dialect, and it's unique all the way through. All of the poems are very unique, and they all have all these coined phrases, these coined words, these nonsense words that the author forms as he's writing these poems. And it seems like the style and the methodology is the same throughout. That even if there's other authors coming in, they're using these same ways of coining new phrases and coining new words, and this same way of like kind of putting together this similar I dialect. So it seems like it's more of a method than it would be an accidental, you know, different authors spoke in different ways or had different words. It seems like it's the book of Job is just more different than the language is more different than any other book in the Bible, to the point where it's like, okay, this is intentionally different.
Wow, very fascinating. Okay, so if the writer is trying to portray itself as, or the book is trying to portray itself as writing or something that happened in the past, but this person is writing in a certain time period way after that, doesn't that hurt our ability to trust other books of the Bible? Because like if this book is, I mean, I don't want to say lying, but giving a different impression than it actually says it is, then like what does it say about our ability to analyze the text in other parts of the Bible?
Wow, that's a really good question. Yeah, so this is I think this goes back to a this kind of is a hermeneutical question in some ways, and part of it is yeah. Let me say that like the way that I interpret the Bible is kind of like, let me rephrase. So I think part of it depends on our goal as biblical interpreters. So you raise a really good question, which is historically the historical question of like when were these books written, and are they more trustworthy if they're closer to the time period, or are they less trustworthy if they're later than the time period? Like these are all historical questions and apologetical questions, and I think the like for me and my goal, like I'm really interested in the Bible itself, and so I guess my favorite analogy is the movie Braveheart. Like if you want to learn about William Wallace, you're going to go to the library and you're going to research William Wallace. You're going to go to Scotland and you're going to see where he rode on his horse or whatever, you know. But if you want to understand the movie Braveheart, you're going to watch the movie Braveheart and you're going to learn about the movie Braveheart. And so with Mel Gibson, his goal was not to tell the entire story of William Wallace. he just, let's just kind of sum up for 2 hours of it. Let's just cut out all this other stuff. We'll sum it up for 2 hours. And in fact, Mel Gibson was like, okay, there's too much. Let's just say that freedom is the most important virtue. It's worth dying for. And then let's take the story of William Wallace and let's just kind of like put it together in a way that tells this message that freedom is worth dying for. And that's really similar to the way John talks about writing history of Jesus. John says, if I wanted to tell you all about Jesus, I would fill the whole world with books about all that Jesus did and said and all that, all the miracles that Jesus did. But I wrote this so that you might believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of the living God. So there's kind of this hermeneutical question of like, is the Bible really just trying to tell history, or is it trying to do something more than that? And it seems to me that most of the Bible is written like John is. Most of the Bible is written in a way to try to communicate these messages and communicate these. When it does tell story, this isn't saying that it's trying to rewrite history or contradict history or anything like that. And but it is trying to say, here's the point from the history. Here's the point of the story. With the Pentateuch too, you see this all the time, and I think you've had a lot of people recently talking about this with the creation accounts, and just like, is it really trying to just tell word for word what happened historically, or is it really trying to say something about humans dwelling in the land, or things like this, God setting up God's relationship with humans? What is the point of Genesis 1 and 2, 1 through 3? So this is so your question is really a good question in terms of like, does this make it less trustworthy? If Job is written way after, does it make it less trustworthy? And obviously, the historicity is important, and the historical questions are very important. The book of Ruth, there's a big debate about Ruth, whether Ruth is written after the exile or rather Ruth was written before the exile. And if it's before the exile, it's saying, the Davidic line there's still hope for the Davidic line. Let's keep looking forward. And if it's written after the exile, it's like, don't give up on the Davidic line, or maybe let's reinterpret the Davidic line. Maybe it's open to more than just Jews. Maybe there's Jews and Gentiles that should be a part of the covenant community, or, things like this. So, some people even say that the book of Ruth was written as a polemic against the Davidic line. That, no, look, he's got a Moabite in his lineage, So, we're always going to have these debates about like, why were these books written, and the historical question, who is the audience? Those are all very important. And the apologetic question also of how reliable are they historically. Those are always going to be the case. But I don't think that with Job, or when we acknowledge that these books are written after the fact and they are written to kind of spin the history in a certain way, I don't think that we're necessarily saying that it's less trustworthy. I think we're just saying that this is really kind of what the text communicates. And it may not be trying to be, a history book. Like, I don't think Job is really trying to teach us a history lesson. I think that Job has a lot of theology to teach us.
Yeah, for sure. So on that topic, if we are, so on that topic, do you think the book of Job is historical in any way?
Yeah, so this is actually the number one question. Can you hear me?
I can.
This is actually the number one question that I get asked by Jewish people. In the Talmud, there's a huge debate about whether or not Job is a real person. Because there, some people are like, God would never actually do this to a human being. Like, there's just no way. This is just a hypothetical, that this is just so horrible. And so there's a big debate about whether or not Job is a historical person. There's also, some people say, well, Job probably did sin really bad earlier on, or something like this, and it's like comeuppance for other things. Job was against the Jewish people. There's all kinds of theories, of like the historically trying to explain like how this could happen if it is historical. So for the evidence that we have is there's a little bit of evidence in Ezekiel 14, where it talks about Job and Noah and Daniel. It says these three people are so righteous. So it's about God's going to destroy, I believe it's Jerusalem that God's going to destroy. Yeah, God's going to destroy Jerusalem. And so it says Jerusalem is so bad. They're so sinful that even if we had the righteousness of Noah and Daniel and Job, even those three men couldn't save it. It's so evil, it's so sinful that, they're not even righteous enough to save Jerusalem. In fact, Jerusalem is so bad they couldn't even save their kids. And that's really all Ezekiel says. It's like this ancient legend. And for a long time, we didn't know, like, why is Ezekiel talking about Daniel, like before Daniel was written? Or, like, was Daniel that famous at the time of Ezekiel? Like it makes no sense. And I think most of the Hebrew manuscripts, they pronounce it, they point it, they give it the vocalization of Daniel, just like Daniel, just like the book of Daniel. But in the 1920s, we found all these Ugaritic texts that we had never really seen before. So there's this other language really close to Hebrew, geographically really close to Israel. We found all these other ancient texts. And so we found a story of a guy named Daniel who was super duper righteous, and his kid is in danger, and his kid actually dies. And he goes on this quest to get his kid's body. And then he finds his kid's body and he's like, oh, yes, okay. And now I'm going to make all these sacrifices to the gods. I'm so super righteous. And then the text just cuts off right there. We don't have the end of the story. But we surmise, based on what Ezekiel's saying, Noah and Job are two super righteous people, and their kids are in danger. Daniel, also super righteous. His kids are in danger. So the theory is maybe Daniel saved his kids at the end, and maybe in the legends of these three great righteous people, everybody knew it. This is the Persian period. Everybody knew these ancient legends. They knew the stories of God and the sea monster, all the creation stories. They knew all these Akkadian legends. And so at the time, they probably knew of these three righteous men, Noah and Job and Daniel, that their kids were in danger, but they were so righteous they saved their kids, or something about their kids in danger at least. So it seems like there was a legend of Job in the Persian period, and a legend of Job that kind of lasted for a long time. And this is a little bit inference, but it seems like we have a very small corpus to work with. And so with Ezekiel, and then with the legend of Daniel and Noah and Job, it seems like this probably was a legend kind of floating around. So it could be like a legend of, it could be a real person. I think there's a bunch of debates about whether or not Robin Hood was a real person, or is it just a legend that we tell people. And I think Job is kind of like that. Like, maybe there was a historical Job, maybe there was a real person, maybe he was righteous and he suffered or whatever. But the book of Job is kind of takes this ancient legend that everybody knew and then makes a hip hop musical out of it. And so and in the book of Job, everybody talks in this amazing, eloquent poetry with all these wordplay and stuff. And in order to do this, you got to sit down and write this poem for weeks, they probably weren't just like saying these poems off the cuff if it's a historical account. So whoever took it, they had to rewrite it anyway. And they had to rewrite it into poetry and rewrite it into a musical in any case. So even if it's totally historical, like, it's probably not a word for word quote of everything that they were saying. So they probably took this ancient legend and then reformulated it into the hip hop musical that we love and enjoy today.
Yeah, kind of on that topic. So one of the papers you showed me, it mentions how the numbers of the flocks and Job's family and kids and all that were super weird, popular numbers. And my first thought is like, oh, all right, that's interesting. It says 7 sons, 3 daughters were born to him. His possessions include 7,000 sheep, 3,000 camels, 500 yoke of oxen and 500 female donkeys. Obviously, you've studied this a lot. Do you have any thoughts on what exactly the purpose of that is and meaning, or do you think it's the actual number of livestock and all that?
Yeah, good. So that's a great point, and that really goes into the historicity of it. It seems like these numbers are just the beginning of Job. He is like super perfect. Everything about him is so perfect. He's just like, I'm making all these extra sacrifices just in case my kids sin. He's just like, I've got all this wealth and it's perfectly 703, and kids are 7 and 3s. Everything is like these like perfect numbers, and everything about Job is just like, it's like super pristine. And then we go to the scene in the behind the scenes in heaven, and God's like, you see how perfect everything is with Job, and the Satan's like, oh yeah, I see that. Yeah. It's because you bless him so much. And so it's like, it really seems like everything is really setting Job up. And almost it's like a little bit, it's too perfect. Like a lot of scholars say that it's hard to even relate to Job in the prologue. It's like, he's super rich, which everybody loves to hate rich people anyway. Like no matter what culture you're in, we all love to hate rich people, So he's super rich and he's super righteous. It's like almost feels like he's lawful evil if you're going on like the RPG categories or the whatever it is. He's not like lawful good or chaotic good. It's almost like lawful evil. He's like so perfectly obeying every little thing. It's like, yeah, maybe lawful evil isn't the best way to describe it, because he really is righteous, but it's like it's hard to relate to this kind of righteousness, like this obsessive righteousness, and this like perfect, everything is so perfect for him. And even like the way that he makes these sacrifices, he makes the sacrifice counts out the exact number of his kids and makes out the exact number of sacrifices, and then at the end of the chapter, that exact number of his kids are all dead. None of it worked. So it seems like it really sets up this perfect situation, and then it just smashes everything apart in just like a couple of verses.
You don't think it's possible? He was like, all right, I'm going to get the perfect number of flock, and we're just going to have the perfect number of kids, and then we're just going to stop. That way everyone knows how perfect I am.
Yeah, actually, yeah, that's probably what he did. Yeah, it was... yeah. He's probably like, is it a girl or a boy? Okay. All right.
we made the cut.
Yeah. 7 and 3, exactly. Okay.
7,000 sheep. Not one more.
Yeah.
Yeah, no. Also near the end, Pete Enns brings this up. It's like when it like restores his family and all that, it gives double his kids, or the same amount of kids, and then double his livestock. And Pete Enns is just like, I mean, I don't know about you, but I'd still be upset about the first set of kids. Like,
yeah.
Doesn't necessarily make up for it.
Yeah. Yeah, it's the same amount of kids. Yeah, everything else is double the same amount of kids. Although Ed Greenstein argues that it's actually the same amount, that it's not double. But most people tend to think that it's double, but not the kids. Same amount of kids.
Boy, so why would that be the same? I mean, aren't the numbers like? I mean, I'll show it on the screen, but aren't they like literally double? Why would they be the same?
Yeah, the word kaful is used, and most people think that it does mean double. But Greenstein has an argument about that term, and I can't remember. I can't remember off the cuff his argument. Le Mishneh. So yeah, it's not kaful, which is double. It's le Mishneh, which I think he's saying that it could be like a second time instead of a double amount. I think that might be his argument. I'd have to double check, but yeah, he says that it was like a test, and then God just resets everything to how it was before the test. But the kids are God. Got new ones though, you know.
Yeah, that'll work out. All right, yeah. So on the topic of like, so there's some people that make arguments that Job is referencing or even like copying or trying to make it so the book of Job is written during the time of Genesis. Can you talk about that and similarities and all that for us?
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, so this is like the Pentateuch. First of all, the Pentateuch is one of the most important books ever written in history. I mean, even today, it's the most important book for several religions, and so at the time of the and during the Persian period, we all know it was super important. Some people say that the Pentateuch was starting to come together as a single book during the Persian period. Whether or not you think that the Pentateuch was written earlier or came together earlier or later, it was still hugely important during the Persian period. And you remember Ezra and Nehemiah. Nehemiah stands up and reads it to all the people, and they all are so moved by it. It's like this, just has this big renaissance of the Pentateuch. It's this really important book during the Persian period, and so it's on everybody's minds. There's also, a lot of the creation stories, all this stuff that we already know are also floating around. Even like, Akkadian stories, the Jewish people had been in exile, so they learned a lot of these other Mesopotamian stories. A lot of them were probably already floating around at the time. It's very the Middle East was the ancient Near East was really what do you call it? Where it's, I guess, a lot of really international. So they borrow a lot from each other's stories and stuff like that already. But the Persian period, the Pentateuch became really, really important. People were thinking a lot about creation, and wisdom. Before I go on to wisdom literature, I also want to say that just the importance of the Pentateuch affects a lot of the writing. So if I'm in the 1950s and I watch a movie and there's a guy with a cowboy hat and a gun on his hip, I know this is a Western, even if it's not historically accurate to the way the Western expansion was in 1800s America or whatever. There become so many genre conventions. It's influenced so many genre conventions. And so with the Pentateuch, you read Job 1 and 2, and it really feels like you're at the time of Genesis 1 through 11. It feels like these genre conventions. And Job's wealth is described like in herds and flocks. He's a nomad. He is a shepherd. It's not described in property. It's not like, it doesn't talk about him and his neighbors in town. It seems like it's kind of worded a lot like his time in Genesis, like the time in Genesis. So it's set up like that. I'm sorry. The original question is, why do people associate it with Genesis? So the stories of Pentateuch are permeating the air, and just Genesis in general is really important. And then also wisdom traditions, wisdom literature is it had kind of grown into this I don't know if you want to say a movement or a school, but the wisdom authors, Proverbs and Ecclesiastes and Job, those are the representatives of wisdom lit in the Bible today. They're the way that they approach faith and the way that they approach religion is very focused on creation and learning from the world around us, very philosophical and scientific. There's not a lot of, like, when you read Proverbs, it's not like go ask the prophet what you should do, or wait until you get a visit from an angel to find out what God's plan is for your life. It's not like this kind of thing. It's like we know from life in this world that this is the best path. This is the best choice. This is the best way to do it. So, two of those books are very skeptical. Proverbs also has some skepticism mixed into it, that they're like, we're asking a lot of questions because we see so many limits on our knowledge, on our wisdom. And that's really how a lot of the creation traditions are in the book of Job. Is creation is so huge. It's so massive. and we're just a drop in the bucket in creation. Ecclesiastes is really big on this too. But in Job, it's like, and really God's the one running the show. God's the only one that has privy to all this wisdom, and we're just a drop in the bucket in creation. So so those are some ways that Job kind of sounds like Genesis. And one thing that I want to point out real quick is the differences between Job 1 and 2 and Genesis. And one of my former professors, Sarah Yeffet, she points this out in an article about Job and Abraham. She compares Job and Abraham, a lot of similarities, really thought-provoking similarities between Job and Abraham, their wealth and their nomadic lifestyle and their tests. But the big difference is divine interaction. And so at the beginning of Job, it seems like we're at this time of Genesis, and in Genesis, God is talking to people all the time. Everybody's having conversations with God. But Job is like, he's doing all these sacrifices and there's no interaction with God at all. And that's a lot more similar to Ezra, Nehemiah, and Esther, some of the last books that are written, where there's very little specific divine interaction like that. Nobody's really having conversations with God in the same way that they are in Genesis and in the rest of the Pentateuch. And so this difference, it's really important. And this is something that I talk about in my dissertation, is that the book of Job, it really sets up this time period, but with no interaction with God. And it really shows this kind of like this period in the Persian period, wisdom tradition, like trying to learn as much as we can from creation, because, we're really kind of trying to figure life out right now without a lot of help, without a lot of, without a lot of solid answers. And so Job is kind of set up like this. But there's a huge difference even from Ezra, Nehemiah, and that is that Job gives us behind the scenes look at heaven, what's happening in the heavenly realm. And it's really unique in the Bible that there's, all these humans, they're not talking like, oh, let's check in with the prophet, or there's no prophetic revelation. There's no direct divine revelation. There's, Job's making these sacrifices just in case. He's trying to do the best he can with the knowledge that he has. And then behind the scenes, he's totally wrong. He can't protect his kids at all. Like his kids are dead. It has nothing to do with his sacrifice or not making a sacrifice. And so it's like there's all this stuff happening behind the scenes that he's oblivious to. And then when he starts talking, he's like, I got to talk to God. I got to hash this out with God because I'm righteous. God made a mistake here. I'm righteous. And the friends are like, oh, no way. You must have sinned or whatever. And Job's like, if I did, like, I doesn't deserve this. Why is God punishing me like this? I got to talk to God. The friends are all so uncomfortable when he starts talking about talking to God. And they talk about even, can't remember the exact details, but Eliphaz, I think it's chapter 22. He talks about repenting and coming back to God, but never says it as in terms of a dialogue or direct conversation with God or anything like that. Eliphaz avoids all that kind of language. Eliphaz is like, who's going to talk to God? Eliphaz sees a vision and he's like, it's like this mysterious kind of in chapter 4. He says this mysterious voice that I heard that, what does he say? What are mortals to God? Like this just really generic kind of vision that he has, and that's like the best we can do is like these dreams and stuff, and really it's Elihu is the only one that kind of affirms divine interaction, that like you're going to be able to see God face to face, like all this language when Elihu talks about facing God, uses a lot of divine interaction, but that's because it's been growing throughout the book. Opens up no divine interaction. The friends are so uncomfortable when Job talks about speaking directly to God. And, there's no hope of that ever happening. And then as the book progresses, Job is more and more vehement about, I got to talk directly to God. I want to hash all this out with God. I got to argue with God. And finally, there's direct divine revelation. There's a direct conversation with God. And Job does get to talk directly to God, and it kind of builds up until the end. And then at the end, when Job makes sacrifices for his kids, he's just hoping, I just in case it's in their hearts. Like I got to try to protect them. But at the end of the book, Job makes, or the friends make sacrifices, and Job prays for the friends, and there's guarantee up front. God talks to Job and says, or talks to the friends and says, Job's going to pray for you, and if Job does that, it's going to protect you. So they know specifically. Very, very helpful having this kind of information up front. Oh, so if I do these things, then I will be protected from God's wrath. At the beginning, we don't have any guarantees. So there's kind of this buildup of divine revelation throughout the book. And that's different from Genesis, but it's also different from the later books. This it kind of like merges the two together in a reverse way of the rest of the Bible, which starts off with a lot of heavy divine revelation and then moves into more prophetic revelation. Oh, sorry. And then Esther, where God isn't even mentioned, or some of the later books where there's very little direct divine revelation.
Did you have anything else you wanted to add there?
So I think I mentioned this earlier. Greenstein has a good article where he talks about how to determine if a text is referencing another text. So and for him, the main criteria is specificity. So for me, I see a lot of similarities between the Book of Job and Alice in Wonderland. They both have a frame tale. They both are full of nonsense poetry. They both coined a lot of nonsense words. Like between the frame tale, it's like normal life at the beginning and end. But in the middle, there's all these debates with antagonistic characters. And then at the end, they go back to normal life. There's a trial. The Queen of Hearts is overseeing a trial, just like there's a trial of Job thinks that he's on trial. There's all these similarities with the Book of Job, but I don't think that Lewis Carroll was trying to make this sound like the Book of Job or referencing the Book of Job. So I point out a lot of similarities, but at some point, Alice had a debate with a character named the Leviathan, or if at some point she says, "Naked I came into this world, and naked I shall go," then I would be like, okay, Lewis Carroll is doing this because the Book of Job does this. But I don't have any specificity to really nail it all down to. And so I think that's always a struggle for whenever you want to say that there's similarities here. Sometimes it's like, these texts are in the air. So the Pentateuch is so important that, when we use language that sounds like creation, or when we use language that sounds like, the nomadic period, it's going to sound like the Pentateuch. It's, it's 6 of these genre conventions or whatever. But there are, if we find specific ways, we can kind of nail down a specific reference to Genesis. And so Michael Fishbane has a great article about arguing that Job 3 draws from Genesis 1 through 3. And like you mentioned, he talks more about, or he talks also about Jeremiah 4, referring to Genesis 1 and 2. And so the Jeremiah article, he has a lot of specific words, Hebrew words that are lined up pretty specifically, this kind of like undoing of the creation narrative. With Job, he very few of the words are the same in Hebrew that they are in Jeremiah. But I do think that Job 3 is using a lot of creation language. He talks about may the day that I was born be in darkness, and may it not see light. It's like light and darkness, day and night, like all these kinds of words that sound like Genesis 1. And so and then the sea monsters wrestling with the sea monsters. May the people that curse the sea monsters curse the day that I was born. It does seem like there's a lot of like creation language in this poem. And Job 3 is an incredible poem. A lot of people say it's one of the greatest poems ever written. It's just, the words are so amazing. The word play is amazing. And just the way that just the progression of it is really, is so tragic and beautiful. And so it does seem like it is using a lot of creation language. One thing that Fishbane points out is that when you're trying to invoke something powerful, creation is going to come to mind. That he talks about how a lot of prayers what scholars may call incantations, things like that, even like magical incantations. A lot of those invoke creation language to the God of the universe. You have created all of humans. You can definitely cure me from cancer or cure this toothache or whatever it is, So there's a lot of the creation language invoked to because creation is so powerful. Like if God creates the world, God can do pretty much anything. So it seems like Job is kind of using this creation language in a similar way, that God is so powerful, and I want all this power that was used to create to be used to destroy the day that I was born, the night that I was conceived. So it does seem like there is a lot of I do see a lot of Genesis influence in Job 3. I don't know that it's specifically following the days of creation. I don't know that I would go that far, but I do think that the creation language is intentional from Job. That it's the night and the day and the light and the darkness, the deep darkness and the gloom and the sea monsters, all of this stuff that's used from creation. It seems like Job is invoking all of this language, and that's something that is pretty heavy in the book, actually. The way that creation is used in the book of Job is similar to the way Proverbs and Ecclesiastes use creation, which is how vast it is, how big it is. We're a drop in the bucket. But Job goes a step beyond and focuses more on, so if we're a drop in the bucket, then what does that say about God's power? That God is so much more powerful, so much more wise than us. And for Job, that's not always a good thing. It's like, I don't have a fighting chance here because God is my legal opponent, and I have no chance of beating this kind of wise, powerful, I can't call God a creature, being, this wise, powerful being. And so actually, let me back up for a sec. In chapters in chapter 1, I think there is a very specific reference to Genesis 1. And that is, Genesis, is it 1 or 2?
Well, what is it?
Genesis 3, Genesis 3. Where Job says, this goes back to Job being like super duper righteous, like hard to relate to him. It's like he loses everything, and he just kneels down, falls down, and worships. And he says, naked I came into this world, and naked I shall return. And in Hebrew, he says, naked I shall return there. But most people see this as like, this is some kind of, he's not going back to his mother's womb, like Nicodemus kind of a thing. Is kind of like, obviously talking about death, like I came naked, and I've lost everything, and I'm gonna die naked. And then he blesses the name of Hashem. He blesses the name of the Lord, and so when he says that, it sounds a lot to me. It sounds a lot like, from dust you came, into dust you shall return. And dust is used a lot in the book of Job, of mortality, of kind of invoking this concept of death as imminent death, or even just how fragile we are. We're just made out of dust, So Job really invokes this as look how fragile I am. And when actually, I'll get to that in a second, because dust comes back again at the end of the book in a very important way. And that seems really similar to Genesis 18, actually. But so in chapter 3, he invokes creation. It's so huge. And I don't know if he talks about dust in chapter 3. I don't see it here. But in chapter 7, he talks about dust a lot. And just, again, this kind of creation language of just how my life is just a breath. Like, I'm just a drop in the bucket here. And, I'm just going to die. I'm going to expire. I'm going to cease to exist. I'm not going to be part of creation anymore. And this is where he says this, epic parody of Psalm 8, where Job says, like, I'm not going to live forever. My life is just a breath. And yeah, God has all of creation. And what are human beings? That God is so mindful of us little human beings. And the psalmist is like, and God still loves us. And Job's like, couldn't you just leave us alone once in a while? Like, why do you always have to look for some little sin that we do? Why do you have to care so much about what we're doing down here when you've got all of creation to think about? And so in Job, creation is always like so huge, so big, so vast, and God is just so wise. Chapter 9 is all about how God created all these things, the constellations and the mountains and all of this creation, and this is who I've got to go up against in court. And so he's, it's like all this stuff, that creation language in the Psalms is like this beautiful, amazing thing. For Job, he's complaining about it. He's like, I can't compete against this, And so, chapter 9, he's like, I can't even find a judge that can stand up against God. Like nobody's gonna take this case. And then, and chapter 10 is one of my favorite chapters, and he invokes a lot of creation language and a lot of he looks at God and he says, you created me, like you fashioned me together. You put together like all the sinews in my body and all of the ligaments, and for no other reason than taking care of your handiwork. Wouldn't you just please not destroy me? Like, why would you put so much effort into creating this human, into fashioning together this handiwork just to destroy him? And Job really has this plea, and again ends in darkness. So many of his poems, he ends in darkness or ends in his breath going out of him and ceasing to exist. He's like, there's nothing for me after this. And chapter 12, he invokes creation, again, talking about wisdom, God's wisdom. Chapter 12, there's a famous satirical hymn. Job sings this hymn of God's wisdom, and a lot of it is God's creation. God has in chapter 12, where does it usually start? I think it's verse 12 where they usually start. Oh, 12 or 13. 13, where God has wisdom and might and counsel and understanding, tears down, none are going to rebuild, all this stuff about how powerful God is. And Job says, even the leaders of the world are under God's control. That's why all these stupid leaders are wandering around in darkness. It's like a bunch of drunkards are leading the world. You ever notice that? That's because God's really running the show. Like, God just enjoys this monopoly on wisdom while the rest of us are just trying to flounder around, see what we can do down here. So there's all this kind of creation language throughout the book, and Job is really, I think we tend to think that Job stays the way that he is in the prologue, where Job's super duper righteous, and so we accept good from God and not evil. But really, in the end, starting in chapter 3, Job starts challenging everything. Like, man, this is not right. Like, I didn't sin. Why is God punishing me? And so Job really starts arguing hard against God, and saying that, like, God is not just. Job says specifically, God is not just. In where is it? In chapter 20. Chapter 27. God has perverted justice. There's a lot of places where Job just says God is not just, and I want a fair trial. And so Job really challenges God. And at the end of the book, Job is blessed for the way that he spoke about God. And that goes back to this word nachonah in Hebrew, where I think most English translations say, you have not spoken right about me like my servant Job has, or you have not spoken truth like my servant Job has. But Ed Greenstein argues, and I follow him on this, that a better translation is honestly. This word is only used one other time in the Bible in this exact form. And again, Job likes to play with the forms of words. So nachon is the usual form, and nachon is like something that you can trust. And it's used of both truth and true, maybe. But nachona is the word used in Job 42. And the only other place it occurs is in Psalm 5, which talks about people that have a flattering tongue that you can't trust. And so those people are not honest. And they're also, I think if I remember right, it's also a forensic context. It's, anyway, yeah, they're deceptive. You can't trust them. And so God says, Job spoke to me in a trustworthy way, not necessarily that everything that he said is true, because clearly some of the stuff that he said about God is hard to swallow. And I mean, I don't think anybody would say that everything Job said is like 100% accurate about God. Like a lot of what he says is, man, I don't know what's going on here. But he did speak honestly, and he really challenged God. Like when he felt like I was unfair, he said it out loud. And the friends are all trying to, okay, no, shh, quiet, Job. You didn't really mean it. I'm sure you didn't mean that God is unjust, Job. So the friends are all trying to just flatter God and just, let's just stick with we learned in Sunday school that God is just. So I'm sure that's how it is, Job. They're trying to shut him up, get him to keep flattering God and whatever. And really the test that Job is in is whether or not he's honest. Is he making sacrifices just to please God? Well, Satan says, well, he's going to curse God right away. But what ends up happening is Job speaks honestly through the whole book. And Job says at the end, like, God blesses Job for being honest. Like, clearly, a man who can say all of this stuff about God is not going to just try to please God. He's clearly not interested in just flattering God and just trying to get favors from God at this point. He's like, man, God's not just. God's, went off on God. And God's like, okay, this is a man that I can trust. Like when he makes sacrifice the next time, all right. I know you're not just trying to get some favors from me here. And whereas the friends, clearly all they want to do is get favors from God. And so maybe I want to have that framework in mind as we look at some of these, because when I talk about Job complaining about God having too much wisdom, Job is really just speaking really raw. He's not trying to fashion together this eloquent theology necessarily. He's just kind of going with his gut on a lot of this, but it comes out in very eloquent, beautiful poetry, thanks to the poets. So anyway, so this is kind of how Job uses creation, is to show God's wisdom and God's might and how it's too much for me. And then when God speaks, and even Elihu too, Elihu invokes creation. Actually, the way Elihu uses creation, he uses the same words as Job did in chapter 10, saying, I too have been formed from the clay, just like you, Job. Like I'm also a human just like you. I'm in the same boat as you. And you can talk to me. Instead of having to face this scary God, you can talk to me. And Elihu really wants to be a mediator for Job and uses creation in the way that Job does in 10 to say we're both just little humans here on this planet. And then when God uses creation, God uses it similar to the way Job did, that I've created so much stuff. You have no idea what's going on. I'm up here running the world, Job. Or sorry, the way God talks is like, yes, of course, Job. I'm running the world. What do you think you're doing? So this is just, scholars have determined that's how God talks in the book of Job. So that's how God talks, uses creation very similar to how Job does. In fact, like God brings in the chaos monster, Leviathan, like I wrestled with the sea. The sea serpent is basically my little rubber ducky, like what you think you could stand up to Leviathan, Job? No, you can't. And Job's like, yeah, that's what I said the whole time. I've been saying this the whole time. Yeah, thanks for telling me all this. And so in chapter 42, so I know you can do whatever you want, that no purpose of yours can be thwarted. But now I see you. and they have a relationship that is totally different than it was at the beginning of the book. Sorry, I kind of got off a little bit from creation, but there's a couple of there's another specific Genesis reference that I want to talk about. The one is naked I came, naked I shall return, and the way that dust is used. And throughout the book, Job keeps talking about, I'm going back to dust. I'm going to lay down in the dust, and I'll never get up again. That's it. Like, I wish I could just die in the dust, and then God can't find me anymore. And so at the end of the book, he says, Emas v'nechamti. Probably there's a lot of debate about what these words mean. The author of Job really likes to take words that mean one thing, but also mean the opposite thing. So if I sanction you to do something, you're allowed to do it. If I put sanctions on you, you're not allowed to do it. And a clever poet will play with this. So you're like, I don't know. It could mean the opposite here. So at the end of the book, Job says, I'm fed up. I'm sick of all this. And I repent. But the word repent could also be I'm comforted. And the word I'm fed up is, a lot of scholars interpret that as I reject, like I reject myself, or I reject dust and ashes, or something like that. So is Job repenting, or is he just sick of all this crap? And so at the end of the book, you really are kind of left with, is Job still angry, or is Job sorry that he was so angry? And they're really, like, everyone has interpreted it so many different ways throughout history. There's been so many interpretations of this. And so at the end, he says, I'm must v'nechamti in dust and ashes, or I must v'nechamti, I'm consoled among dust and ashes. And this term dust and ashes is used 3 times in the Bible. One is in chapter 30 of Job, where Job is like, I'm just dust and ashes over here trying to deal with all this, And then the other is in Genesis 18, where Abraham is trying to argue with God. And this is something that Sarah Yeffet points out in her article about Abraham and Job, is that Abraham is so silent during his test where he sacrifices Isaac. It's hard to relate to Abraham. Like, he's just so silent and obedient. We don't know what's going on in his mind. Like how is he doing this? And why? Like, even why is he doing that? And even it's even a lot of us even ask ethical questions. Is it okay for Abraham to just do this unquestioningly? And then the question of, why would Abraham fight so hard against punishing Sodom and Gomorrah, and then just silently go and sacrifice his kid? Like, these are big questions that we ask of Abraham. And so in chapter 18 is where Abraham is so vocal and so like, no, let's negotiate here. Let's fight this out. Let's really talk this out with God. And, argue, what if we find like just, one righteous donkey? Then are you going to save Sodom and Gomorrah? And God's like, sure, go find me a righteous donkey. Let's do it. And you can't even find and nothing that's righteous in Sodom and Gomorrah. And so this is where Abraham at the end is like, man, I debated the Almighty God when I'm nothing but dust and ash. And so this at the end, when Job is like, man, I reject and repent, or I'm fed up but I'm consoled as dust and ash. He says, I'm nothing but dust and ash. Like the maybe the human condition, or just the fact that I'm dust and ash, and maybe even I think also maybe invoking the literal dust and ash, that Job is covered in dust and ash as a mourner. But he says, like, I've debated against God here. I've gone face to face in a debate with God, even though I'm dust and ash. And now my eye sees you. Very similar to Abraham arguing with God. And one other mention of Genesis in the same poem, the first thing Job says is, now I know that you can do whatever you want, and no plot of yours can be thwarted. No scheme of yours can be thwarted. That is almost word for word what God says in Genesis 11:6 of 11:6. Almost word for word what God says almost word for word what God says of the humans building the Tower of Babel in Genesis 11:6. That, oh, look at this, these guys are building a tower up into heaven. Now what are they? Whatever they want to do, nothing's impossible for them. No scheme of theirs can be thwarted. And so Job is kind of like reversing this back. You actually have all the cards, God. Like you've got all the cards. Like humans, we can't even build a tower to heaven without you stopping us. We can't do anything without you stopping us. You're in control of all the heavens and the earth, just like you've been telling me for the past 2 speeches. And he says, like, I have no counsel, no wisdom. God has a monopoly on wisdom. But my eye did see you, even though I'm dust and ash. Like I still kind of got to see God and have this face-to-face conversation with God. And it is a conversation. It's not just the Lord speaking at Job. Job responds twice, even though Job can't talk a whole lot. Job responds twice and has this conversation back at God. And so again, this dust and ashes invokes some of the same thing that he says at the beginning. Naked I came, naked I shall return. We're just dust and ash, and drops in the bucket of creation. God is all powerful. God has created all this stuff. Like, what can we expect to get from God? And at the end, he gets a direct audience with God, a very intimate audience with God, and says, even though I'm just dust and ash here, even though I'm just a drop in the bucket of creation, God stopped everything and paid attention to me to have this conversation. So it's very significant, and again, invoking creation language, invoking Genesis, very specific part of Genesis. Sorry to talk so much.
Yeah, no worries. That's very fascinating, because on the one hand, like Genesis 1 is obviously about, well, I guess you have different interpretations and all that, but typically what we focus on isn't like, oh, how great God is, and then Job is using like almost a different perspective of how we typically look at Genesis, and so it's very fascinating.
That's true. It's so intimate in especially Genesis 2. It's very intimate, like the creation story. And for Job, it's like, it's so huge. God is so transcendent.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. It's on one hand, it's like sure, it is showing how great God is, but it never specifically like, oh, God is so great to do this. Like, obviously, Adam and Eve aren't saying anything about that.
Yeah,
they're doing the opposite.
Yeah.
So, shoot, let's see. So my first thought when you said that Job is using Genesis language, but never really, or only quotes from it just a little bit. Originally, you said that the specific part they weren't quoting from it, but just the idea of it. My first thought was like, oh, okay, maybe he's referencing like a different creation or like a common idea in their culture instead of the actual text. But then you said that it pretty closely or directly quotes from Genesis 11. So do you have any thoughts on like, would you say that it's like just the idea of Genesis and maybe he's not actually looking at the text of Genesis 1 or something like that? Or do you have any thoughts on that one?
Yeah, that's a good question. Yeah, and thank you, because I don't want to contradict myself. I think that overall in the book, there's a lot of creation language, and even some of it, like some of the chaos monster stuff, it seems more like Enuma Elish and the epic battle with the sea monster than it is from Genesis. That it's kind of like invoking all these legends and these kinds of like general creation ideas to really show God's power. And not saying that Job quotes Enuma Elish as scripture or anything, but or even that Job is trying to say that this is how creation came about, was God wrestling with the sea monster. It really is just kind of invoking this imagery, this creation imagery of God's power, which the Enuma Elish legend of creation seems to seems to emphasize the power of the God, the Creator God, maybe more than whereas Genesis emphasizes intimacy of God a little bit more, and preparing the land for man or whatever, for preparing the land for humans or whatever it may be. It seems like the Enuma Elish legends, some of the other ancient Near Eastern stories of creation do emphasize the power and transcendence of God. So that's maybe one thing too, where there's some more generic creation language that Job uses. But the book of Job, and also Job takes place in a land far away. And so, there a lot of the way that it's written is really trying to make Job sound like he's not from around, like we're all Israelites. The author is clearly an Israelite, or someone who believes in the same God as Israel. And uses the name of God throughout the book. Not when people talk, though. When people talk, they call God Eloah, but they don't call God by the name of God, by the Hebrew name of God. And so, but the author does, and the narrator uses the name of God all the time. And so, it's really trying to set everything outside of Israel as much as possible, but written for an Israelite audience. So when all these other legends are invoked, it also kind of helps add to this foreign element. Like, oh, this is what they say over there. This is how creation happened over there. Is this epic battle with the chaos monster and stuff like that. And everybody kind of knows that legend at this time. The Psalms invoke the chaos monster battle with God a few places and stuff. So there is a lot of places where it's generally kind of invoking creation stories, or invoking maybe even the language of Genesis. But then there are a couple of places where I do think it is specifically referencing Genesis. And I do think that just the words are very specific in 42:2, where Job says, I know that no scheme of yours can be thwarted. It's very, very, very close to the way God says this of the Tower of Babel. And then dust and ash is used only a couple of places in the Bible, only 3 places in the Bible. 2 are by Job, and the other one is Abraham right after he argues with God. And I think that also is a direct reference to Genesis. And naked I came, naked I shall return. Maybe that was more of a general phrase or something, but I haven't seen it anywhere else in the ancient Near East. Maybe I just can't think of a spot right now, but I can't think of a place in the Bible either where it's I came from and I'm going to, talking about life and death. It seems like it's Genesis and Job are really the only 2 places that I can think of. At least I think maybe Second Temple there, Ben Sira says something like that. I can't remember, but so it seems like those seem like they're pretty specific connections to Genesis itself to me.
Yeah. Well, also, I wanted to add that, to dust you are, dust you shall return. Naked you are, naked you shall return. But of course, the whole Adam and Eve narrative has, them being born naked, or being born. I mean, they weren't exactly born, created, whatever. They're created naked, and then God clothes them later. Do you think maybe like it's like combining the themes there, or maybe just like a cultural idea of just language and all that?
Wow, that's a great question. Yeah, that's really, really observant. Because even them being naked is such an important part of the story, and the shame that they feel. That probably is really intentional from Job, really trying to draw not just that I'm dust, but also that like this nakedness that I have, like the emptiness, like I have nothing now. Like I'm, I don't know if it's the dependence on God, or if it's shame, or what it might be specifically off the top of my head, but there is but I would guess that you're right, that it is very specific, that to change it from dust to naked, it probably is also influenced by the Genesis story, that they want it, like Job wants to invoke more than just life and death, but something a little bit heavier from that. Maybe shame, or maybe just the emptiness that I've lost everything.
Yeah. And of course, in the Genesis narrative, like there's definitely a shame aspect, but it's not the main thing. Of course, in Job, it's a huge part of all that's going on. Yeah. So, anything else you wanted to add there? That's all my questions I have for you.
Yeah, I feel like I probably talked too much about everything. I'm sorry, you're probably gonna have a big. It's probably gonna be really tough to edit.
No. This will be fun.
All my rambling, but yeah, I think the book of Job is just such a beautiful book, and it really kind of lets us. It says I know that it's hard to believe. Like the author of Job, or the authors of Job, they're like, I know it's hard to believe in God sometimes. I know that you suffer sometimes. I know that sometimes you just want to yell and scream, and it's okay. Like, we're all like this. This is part of being human. Like, this is part of being dust and ash. But at the same time, God is still listening, and God blesses us for being honest, instead of always just trying to pretend like everything's okay when it's not. And the use of Genesis, the use of creation, it really invokes this transcendent nature of God, and then kind of pulls the rug out from under it at the end, where God is suddenly so immanent and so intimate with us that we share that. Not only at the beginning, Job's being tested for his honesty. Is he really doing this because he loves God, or is he doing this because he wants to get favors from God? And then at the end, God is also honest with Job, that they have this intimacy together, where they just openly share themselves with each other, and they share this relationship. And throughout the history of interpretation, both Christians and Jews talk about how intimate this relationship is, and it's often compared with Moses. A lot of historic medieval interpreters said that Job was even closer to God than Moses, that Moses talked face to face with God as a friend, but Job talked even more face to face with God, and Job was even more intimate with God than Moses. And others, there's debate. People say that Moses is more intimate or whatever, but that's a very common comparison, is Moses and Job, with this intimacy that they had with God. And even like John Chrysostom, the Christian preacher from I believe he's third or fourth century CE. He says that he describes it at the beginning when God starts talking. He says God scooted up the divine throne and then leaned down to talk to Job, almost like Santa Claus or something. It's like just the intimacy that most interpreters see, that it comes through this storm wind, and it seems so transcendent. Again, it seems so transcendent, but the way that it's written, it really ends up in this very personal moment between Job and the Lord. So anyway, I think a big part of using this creation language is really showing God's transcendence. But then it kind of goes back to, I guess, like the Genesis 2 way of saying it, of this intimacy of God and God's creation. That, Job's like, you fashioned me together just to destroy me. And at the end, God has really paid a lot of attention to Job. That, God isn't just kind of willy-nilly. Well, depends on your interpretation of Job's suffering, whether or not it's willy-nilly, it's just some bet with Satan, or if it's whatever. But it is, at the end, it is very intimate between God and Job, and the way the creation language is kind of like the rug is pulled out from under the creation language. So I'm starting to repeat myself now. You're muted again.
All right, awesome. Well, I appreciate you coming on. Thank you so much, Ryan. I really encourage other people to check out your channel, which will be in the description. Is there anything else that you want to get people connected with? You have an Instagram with all your breakdancing. I know that. Got anything else for us?
Yeah, yeah, that's the other side of my life is b-boy Loose Goose, and yeah, I'm a member of Dynamic Rockers breaking crew. So yeah, if you want to see me dance, you can search up b-boy Loose Goose. And yeah, my Bible and Culture with Dr. Armstrong is the channel that I'm starting to grow. I'm gonna take a short hiatus and build up some content, and then come back. Hopefully, September, I'll come back with steady, consistent content. That's a real goal of mine. I really want to talk about my scholarship and just talk about the Bible. You know, create my own curriculum. So looking forward to that. So yeah, check out my YouTube channel, please. Bible and Culture with Dr. Armstrong, and hopefully in 2 years you can buy my book.
There you go. I'll be first on the list.
Thank you.
Appreciate it. All right. Appreciate you coming on again, and yeah, hope you have a great rest of your day. Thanks, Ryan.
Thank you so much, Zach, and great channel. Thank you for all that you're doing with this channel. Really appreciate the way that you're bringing in so many interesting and important topics, and bring it to a thinking audience, which is important.
Appreciate it. Awesome, man. I appreciate that. Thanks.
Yeah.
All right. Have a good one,
Thank
Ryan.
you so much. You too. Take care.